Yesterday, we examined this idea of the blues and looked at what the blues is about. That definition that we have for blue, or blue note preaching, that is preaching about tragedy but not falling into despair. And focusing on this idea to understand what it is. And in the merging of lifting up that text in Ezra, that there was a gospel shout and there was a blues moan. And in the merging of those two pieces, that the speaking of the blues, the recovery of the blues, and a blue note sensibility is what we are called to do in this postmodern and post-soul age if we are to preach prophetically, is to regain that. And today I just want to go down that same path as we look at this idea of blues, but begin from a different vantage point. To begin with a story that comes out of South Carolina, a story that has really been passed from mouth to ear. From the palmetto trails of South Carolina, known as the Low Country, as it's called, somewhere in the island of St. John, where the Gullah people live. A mythic tale of truth was born, bound by the nostalgic hyperbole, rooted and fertilized by the souls of displaced transatlantic Africans. No one knows the exact origin of this tale. The details seem to differ depending upon the writer or the teller, but the meaning remains the same. The tale was forged somewhere between the wisdom of West Africa and the tragedy of American slavery. It's the story of a people who could fly. The tale begins on the island of St. John as displaced Africans who had been mislabeled as slaves, toiled in the hot sun under the devious, watchful eye of a nameless slave driver. Among this group of coffee, black, mocha brown, and caramel-colored people was a woman tending her child as she was picking cotton. She had such dexterity that she could pick cotton with her right hand and caress the forehead of her child with the left. As she was picking cotton, exhausted from the pressure, working in the humid conditions when her body gave out under the stress and weight, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, of being a problem and property all at the same time. Her strong yet frail body simply collapsed under the weight of waking up every day to face the tragedy and the absurdity of a people who claimed to be Christian but always lived in contradiction. This woman, this nameless woman, fell to the ground. Her boy, who could have been no more than 6 or 7, attempted to wake his mother from this disoriented state, knowing that if the slave masters were to witness this sudden stop in work, punishment would be swift and hard. The slave drivers noticed that the woman had fallen under the gaze of the shadow of the cotton, and they climbed their beasts of burden to ride to the place where she had disappeared. They moved across the field, but before the driver could reach her, an old man came over to the woman who had fallen. The people called him preacher or prophet, but the slave master called him old devil. The little boy looked into the kind face of this old man and simply asked, "Is it time?" The old man just smiled and nodded and uttered one word in the woman's ear and the same word into the boy's ear and said, "Kuliba." The woman miraculously gained strength when the word entered her ear and landed on her spirit. As a matter of fact, the other Africans stopped working to witness the birth of a queen. For a moment, she rose from the ground. She looked toward the slave drivers who were riding their beasts of burden toward her and looked at her son. She grasped his hand, and they both looked up toward heaven, and they began to fly. The slave drivers lost their composure, unable to process this idea of human flight. During their brief moment of disbelief, the preacher ran to the other slaves and told them, "It's time." He began to utter the word, "Kuliba, Kuliba, Kuliba." The Africans rose from the fields, and their flight to freedom began. Can you imagine this sight? The dehumanized flying, 3/5 of a person flying, the disenfranchised flying, the dishonored flying, the disempowered flying, the discouraged flying, the dismissed flying, the dismembered flying, the disadvantaged flying, the diseased flying, the disinherited flying, the dislocated flying. all taking flight with such grace and beauty to a world no one had yet seen. The slave drivers grabbed the old man, beat him within an inch of his life. They interrogated him, but the more they beat him, the more he smiled as blood flowed from his brow. The slave master demanded that he bring back the slaves. The old man looked at them and smiled and simply said, "I can't. Once the word is in them, it will never leave them." The old man was given an ancient word. He was a steward of the mysteries. The word Kuliba originated on the shores of West Africa and literally means God is in you. He did not create it, he just spoke it. The prophet did not keep the word, he did not create it. He just passed on the word that was given to him to someone else. He did not hoard the word. He passed on the word so that someone else could be freed by this word. He did not own it. He did not own it. No, there was something about the old man, this preacher, that reminds every woman and man who is called by God what we must do. We are not called to make people shout. We are not called to make people dance. We're not called to make people feel good. We are not called to preach what people want to hear. We are called to give a Kuliba word. A word that will move in one's spirit so that people will take flight. Fly from their breakdowns to a breakthrough. From, in the words of my father, from disgrace to dignity. To moving from being recognizing that they are a blessing from God. We are called to place a word in people. We are called to allow the word to develop. We do not own it. We did not create it. We are called to be a conduit for a Kuliba word that transforms people to a new level. This is the power of blue note preaching. It is a Kuliba word that moves people from, in the words of my father again, from disgrace to dignity. And the griot who has been charged to tell the story used her dynamic imagination and interpretive lens to create an alternative world in the collective mind of the village. The griot through the story is saying tragedy will not have the last word. Despair will not engulf my soul. The griot, the preacher, carries a healing medicine formed from the sonic resonance of breath and vibration. Kuliba. The word has power. Just as the word becomes flesh, the word has power. And if we want a generation to take flight, if we desire for preaching to continue to empower people to fly, we must move back with a Sankofa spirit and reclaim the blue note power of preaching. The task of the preacher is to wrestle with the blue note of life and find assurance of grace in the gospel. Blue note preaching requires a different hermeneutic. The preacher is required to do the academic work, the exegetical digging, all of these tools, but the preacher is required to submit to the Spirit and be possessed by divine imagination. The preacher, the blue note preacher, views the preaching task as art. Words are the preacher's craft, the paintbrush of the painter, the instrument of the composer. This is art, not technical precision. Art deeply expressed through the personality of the preacher. In the words of Phillips Brooks, Thomas Merton gives a definition of art that is applicable to preaching. Art enables us to find ourselves and lose ourselves at the same time. Blue note preaching is the creation of an alternative world and an alternative consciousness. As the story of the people who could fly illustrates, the preacher breathes a word into the people and they are found. They are given life and they rise above the degradation of the plantation. The story is also a story of being consumed by a power beyond oneself. The people fly and disappear, never to be heard of again. The word gives them agency, but they are also carried away to a land only conceived in their imagination. The imagination of the story gives eschatological hope while staring at existential darkness. I'm on the plantation, but I'm not of the plantation. And when the word is in me, I'm ready to return home. The task of the preacher who seeks to recover a blue sensibility must be to create a hermeneutic that views the text with an artistic eye and a blues lens. This is not a new idea, but one that has been lifted and learned down through the ages. It is the poet, the artist, the dancer, the writer, the Hebraic prophet who understands the need for metaphor, symbol, double entendre, image, and sound. We cannot encounter the holy with easy definitions. Nor can we engage people with words and images with a singular meaning. We need a kuliba word, a word with multiple definitions that when it's spoken, Anthony, brings new meaning. The blues lens for hermeneutical interpretation offers a wider palette of colors to the preacher who is attempting to paint in a postmodern world that is addicted to ease, empire, and markets. It is Jerome Clayton Ross, assistant professor of Old Testament at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University, who shares the powerful view and implications of this type of hermeneutic of preaching. He says this: except for the reign of David through Solomon, the Yahwists were dominated by superpower nations during the biblical period. These nations superimposed their cultures upon nations or peoples whom they ruled, thereby establishing standards of living for them. Ross goes on to share the 6 kingdoms that put forth a form of colonialism upon the Hebraic people: Egypt, Assyria, the Babylonians, Persian, Greeks, and Romans. This has a profound implication for preaching. If we are to recover a blues sensibility, we have to have the audacity to read the Bible with a blue note lens. Understand the blues inherent in the Bible and preach what we read. The hermeneutic for the Blue Note homiletic seeks contextualization and artistic imagination drawn from the engagement with Scripture and deep abiding spirituality. The preacher uses all the tools at her disposal, working to understand context in light of limited freedom and agency of an ancient people and communicating grand theological ideas of the gospel. It is through the merging of artistic imagination that we are given a broader understanding not only of the text, but of the activity of God. Artistic imagination, in the words of Eugene Lowry, is dancing on the edge of mystery. Artistic imagination, in the words of Dr. Tisdale, is rekindling the fire within. Yes, it is Father Maple, Herman Melville's character in Moby Dick, who tells this statement in there. He says, "Woe to whom this world charms from the gospel duty." The artistic imagination gives over to the world a blues sensibility to create a new world for the preacher. And so I want to give you some of this idea of artistic imagination. And so as I dipped my pen into ink in my own sanctified imagination, that I was able to write a blues song. But it was a blues song that really came out of the experience of David. A song, a poem, a prose. I call it the rooftop blues. Dealing with David. The priest's role is to play the blues in public space. The people join in the song, acknowledge the story, and even place embers upon the fire of atonement. The story of David and Bathsheba is a story I like to call simply the rooftop blues. It speaks to the eternal tragedy of human folly, nurtured by our gluttonous ego. While upon the rooftop, David gazes upon the body of a woman who ceases in his eyes to have agency. Let me let you hear some rooftop blues for a moment. David's gaze is cast upon the stone skyline of the kingdom. He breathes a deep breath and exhales and wonders how his men are faring in their campaign. Triumph has become an expectation for him. The pacing upon the floor late at night has been replaced by elusive moments of anxiety, which are quickly dispelled by the history of triumph and otherworldly promise of his God. He is king, raised from the barrio of Bethlehem, dismissed by all, including his own father, who didn't think he could become a king. The thought that he could be wanted and valued by God as a leader was absurd to his father. The thought brings an ironic smile to David's face, not for joy, but for sadness. His father never believed he had the ability to lead. In his parental consciousness, David would forever chase the smell of wool and manure in the fields of Bethlehem. until the day the prophet showed up and a wide vision was cast through the narrow window of Bethlehem. David always had more heart than strength and was willing to face any bully on the playground or on the battlefield, as with the case with Goliath. He was king now, and he could not erase the light ache in his heart. He would always be the boy from Bethlehem, the little barrio shepherd with country ways, who could not erase the stench of wool and manure from his skin. As he continued to look across the horizon of the city, his eyes rested upon a rooftop. The sun danced across the black skin of a woman bathing in a tiny tub, not realizing his mouth was slightly open. He imagined his next campaign as he stared. It is the preacher, when staring into the story of David, who must refuse to be sentimental. The blue note of interpretation pushes aside a Sunday school faith and calls the preacher prophet to dance to the rhythm of the blues. We recognize our humanity and contradiction in David. We witness our folly and see God lurking in the corners as a metaphysical narrator. The preacher must resist the call to edit for acceptability and dare to speak tragedy before the people who want to forget but must remember in order to be healed. When the prophet dares to expose the congregation who is living in darkness to the light, the initial reaction is to wince in pain. Our eyes have adjusted to the dark. Our world has been designed by shadows, not truth. The preacher causes pain, but slowly, very slowly, we adjust to the light. And in adjustment, we see David, Tamar, Absalom, and Amnon. We see fathers, sisters, brothers, aunts, and cousins. If we gaze is long enough, we witness structures and ideological myths and duets with demons, and we co-wrote songs that are in heavy rotation in our consciousness with people who seek to destroy who we are. It was not long ago that almost every year at Trinity I deal with a text of terror. And one particular text of terror that I always have to deal with, because she sat down next to me one time in my imagination, is a sister by the name of Tamar. And now normally, especially within our tradition, you got to have some good news when you preach. And when you're talking about Tamar, the question is, there ain't no good news up in that one. But as I had a conversation with Tamar, she simply asked me, just do this, Otis, just tell my story to the church. And it was very important that a man say the story, because it was the pulpit and patriarchy that crushed so many sisters. To have the opportunity to share her story. And as I stood before the congregation, I said to Tamar, and every Tamar, we are sorry we did not speak up for you. We did not call your name. We allowed the patriarchy and peculiar ideas for next level blessings to overtake our theology. We are sorry for not telling your story. And as I stood before the people and Tamar whispered in my ear, I told the story, Tamar's story. I said that it was not your fault. I let them know that there was collusion between a cousin and a brother who violated you. But the real violation was not just what happened with Amnon and Joab. The real violation was that your daddy didn't say anything. How do you recover from the fact that your father is silent, but your father knew? And the question was, where is this good news? And Tamar did something with a womanist ethic, with a liberation perspective. She said, David, since you won't speak for me, I'm going to go ahead and speak for myself. I will not use words. I'm just going to change my clothes. I'm going to put on sackcloth and ashes. Which I know that you are a political fellow and you want everybody to think everything is all right in the palace. But when they see me walking with my sackcloth and ashes, there will be whispers in Israel that not everything is all right in the kingdom. And as we communicated and as Tamar talked in my ear, there was a particular imaginative revelation that happened at that moment, saying that yes, you must put on sackcloth and ashes. But Tamar whispered and said, I wore them for a good portion of my life. Tell everyone in the church make sure they have a change of clothes. Wear your sackcloth. Know that there was pain and violation, but do not let that define who you are. At some point, you must change your clothes. And this was the thing that was so interesting and amazing as I told the story of my sister who is now in the battlements of heaven, that my sister who was challenged with mental illness and who is now in the battlements of heaven, that she did something so powerful for me on several levels. One of the reasons that I am able to stand here before you and talk about Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin and Langston Hughes and all of those with the blues sensibility, because at the age of 4, 5, 6, and 7, instead of reading me Dr. Seuss, she read Zora Neale Hurston to me. And so it was always in my spirit. By the time I got to college, I already had Zora imprinted on my soul, but I didn't even know it until the teacher started talking. I said, I know who she is. Because that was my bedtime story when I was going to bed as a child. I remember when she came home from Spelman one summer, and she was feeling sad. My room was next to hers, and she was crying. She was crying because someone had treated her bad. And I said, well, you know, I'm a little brother, 9 years younger. I'm about, 8 and whatnot. I said, well, tell me where the brother is. I'll take care of him. I'm your little brother. That's what brothers do. That's what we do. We're going to take care of things. She said, no, that's all right. There's nothing that you can do. I said, just let me know. I will roll. I will get on my bike and I will roll. I said, whatever I got to do, I will do it. I said, no, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Everything is okay. And so she was depressed for a good portion of the summer. And she was crying. I would hear her crying at night. Then one night, I heard her snapping her fingers, and she was shouting and having a good time. And I said, Daphne, what's going on? You've been crying all summer. She said, well, the Lord removed the blues from me, took away the pain. I said, well, how did that happen? He said, well, I was listening to the radio. I said, well, what happened? He said, I heard a song. I said, well, some gospel song come on? She said, no. I was listening to some old school songs, and a disco song came on. I said, the Lord does not speak through disco. She said, no, I'm telling you. It's a disco song. Changed my life. I said, well, what happened? Well, you see, sometimes God will send prophets in other kind of ways. And I was listening to these old school songs when all of a sudden a sister by the name of Gloria Gaynor came on. A song called I Will Survive. And I started hearing this song. At first, I was afraid. I was petrified. Kept thinking I could never live you by my side. But then I spent so many nights thinking how you did me wrong. And I grew strong. And I learned how to get along. But she said the point I like is this. Go on now. Go walk out the door. Just turn around now, because you're not welcome anymore. Were you the one who tried to hurt me with goodbye? Did you think I crumbled? Did you think I laid down and die? Oh, no, not I. Oh, you know it. I will survive. Oh, as long as I know how to love, I know I will stay alive. I've got all my life to live. I've got all my love to give. I will survive. Do you know it? I will survive. Hey, you know it. And as I presented on that particular Sunday, the congregation began to sing the song. The musicians joined in with Gloria Gaynor. And all of a sudden we were singing I Will Survive, and it became an invitation to the altar. And then women who had been violated but were now victors came to the altar, but not facing the altar, faced the congregation and said, I will pray with you. And they prayed together. And they began to build prayer partnerships to let them know, I've been where you are. And I am here to walk with you to set you free. When the preacher refuses to edit for accessibility, God can speak in a way that God does not speak when you have the abridged version of the gospel. And the prophetic gaze is a blue note gaze that dares to shatter and reshape the world. The preacher must not approach the text with forensic distance, but artistic passion. The lives of the people, the world of the story, the pain of the characters must encroach the consciousness of the preacher and the people. The artistic approach looks at the Bible as a living word, not a dead scroll. Our lives are swirling between the lines from the lips of men and women of the text. A mirror is pushed to the surface from beneath the dust, dirt, and sand, covering from time period to time period. We are reunited with ourselves. We become like Dorian Gray, inspecting his own portrait painted by Basil Hallward. Dorian noticed that his portrait carried every sin, crime, violation he had perpetrated. And in our portrait, we notice that sin, sanctimonious self-righteousness, and arrogance have corrupted a beautiful, divinely drawn picture of humanity. The person we think we are is not congruent with the figure in the painting. Every cruelty, rebellion, unethical act, and amoral position is recorded on the canvas. The preacher paints with a homiletical brush upon a spiritual canvas. The courage of the preacher rests in this artistic danger, Freddie. The artist, the preacher, is always at risk of rejection by a people who wrongfully believe that they have been called, that they have called and commissioned the preacher to paint a flattering family portrait to be hung in the northwest corridor of their heart. What a danger to preach, for preaching brings the purveyor in contact with a world of conflict and contradiction. Those who see themselves as patrons and not parishioners will seek to destroy and discredit the artist, the preacher, the prophet for painting a portrait that dares show the ugly tragedy that is held in the life of ordinary women and men. Now, many who hear and read the blues misinterpret the songs as sorrow meditations. Music designed to focus on suffering and boxed in by a narrow anthropology. I say no. Blues is a celebration. After one has found a new blue note hermeneutic and dares to reach into the imagination with an artistic lens, something happens. What from the outside looks like sorrow is turned into unspeakable joy. This seems like an impossibility. But joy comes from the blues. There is no shouting like shouting in a black church about the resurrection of Jesus. As a matter of fact, you can say the same thing every week. They hung him high, stretched him wide, and then he died. But early on Sunday morning, before the rooster started to crow, every week you can say the same thing. Because it's the retelling of a story. It's the retelling of a narrative. But the joy and the shout that is heard on Sunday morning is deeply tied to the blues of Good Friday. Sunday is impossible without the blood of Calvary. That you cannot get to that moment of a shout without dealing with the pain of Friday. Scholar and iconic activist Angela Davis brilliantly defines the blues, the power of speaking and singing the blues. Blues singers, especially women, use the blues to reorient the psyche after the disorientation of patriarchy and racialized oppression. Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday preached through song. Their words created a world where women were empowered. All three used voice, sound, song, and speech to connect to the spirituality informed by Africa and shaped by America. I like how Bessie Smith says it here, Brother Dyson. It may be a week, it may be a month or two, but the day you quit me, honey, is coming back to you. The blues became an empowering mechanism for Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and Billie Holiday. The power of the blues, yes, the power of the blue note, and blue note sensibility cannot be completely written down. Stephen Webb calls this a theology of sound or theoacoustic engagement. Preaching is an oral art, not a written form. We're not doing essays up here, y'all. It is rooted in sound, the dynamics of the voice. That is your paintbrush. That is your tool that one uses. Whatever that sound may be, whether it is a dynamic, a high, loud, booming voice, whatever, use what God gave you. It's rooted in sound. Preaching is not preaching on paper, but when it is performed. And when I say performed, I'm not talking entertainment. Performance is an act of preaching, not entertainment, but the act of experiential embodiment of an idea using all sensory resources to communicate to another person. Now, it's fascinating that, especially in certain traditions, when people will raise the question, even raised it with me and said, why do you communicate that way? You move so much, you seem so excited, when you communicate it. Well, yes, I am. I'm talking about Jesus. Jesus is worth being excited about. And so it makes complete sense to be excited. But there is an embodiment. There's an embodiment that happens when something is deeply resonating in your spirit and in your soul. Musicians do it all the time. If you watch Miles Davis, there's one way that he plays. If you look at Thelonious Monk, there's another way that he plays. Sometimes he has to spin around. And every preacher has that particular embodiment. When I watch my father when he preaches, he'll grab his lapels right here. When I see Freddie Haynes preach, he'll do like this every once in a while. When I see Michael Dyson preach, that he'll go like this and start going and moving his hands. When I see Youngblood preach, he'll throw his hands up like this. There's a different embodiment. When Dr. Hale preaches, she'll put that hand on her hip and put out here and she'll start going. There is an embodiment to preaching, that something happens. It's not just your voice, it's your entire being. That everything should be used. When you are presenting that which is holy, that which is elusive, one must use your voice and use your mind, use your heart, use your spirit, use your body, because it is an artistic dance. It's what is happening before the people. Performance is an act of preaching. Preaching uses all the dynamics of communication, and Blue Note preaching especially takes culture into consideration to communicate. Dr. Teresa Fry Brown of Emory University, borrowing from linguist Dale Laheim, suggests cultures possess communicative competencies for sharing. A sender and a receiver share rules of language structure from topic and event within a given culture. Communication is enhanced when the speaker and listener understand all the rules of engagement. Blue Note preaching is experiential, dialogical performance. Like Bessie Smith, the preacher uses sound and musicality to persuade, paint, proclaim, and preach. Blue Note preaching demands the preacher embody the word. Speech theory derived from Walter Ong is helpful to understand the sacred nature of speech. Speech leaves no trace in space. Once it's done, it's gone. It is so perfect medium, as Ong says, for the communication of God, God's word, as Stephen Webb has lifted up. No other medium can carry the supernatural message with such power as sound. Sound delivers something that is external, but cannot be controlled. What is written, the written word, can be copyrighted, and someone can say, I own it. But once that word goes out, no one can own it nor grab it. The only way you can recall it is through the reconstruction with your imagination. Words can be copyrighted, visuals can be owned, someone can keep it in their house, but not when it comes to speech, according to Ong and to Webb. Once the sound has finished the act, only memory can reconstruct the evidence of the event. The act of producing speech and hearing what is produced is an intimate act. You can see light from a distance. Called lighthouses. They can go out about 11 miles to 14 miles. But the closer you are, the better you can hear. Because sound requires intimacy. No matter how big your speakers may be, no matter how deep the bass you may have in your car, sound still requires intimacy. The closer I am, the better I hear. The better I understand. And what is so interesting, it's interesting that the Hebraic people share with us that God cannot be seen, but it's through sound and speech that God is encountered. Now look at this. God remixes physics in the creation of the world. Now, in terms of physics, it is a light that travels faster than sound. But in order for God to create light, God has to speak that which is slower than light. And then light comes into being because of the sound. It is the sound that brings light into being. And once sound is released, then light is supposed to be more faster than sound, but it is still the sound. When Moses encounters God, it is not the visual of the burning bush, it is the sound of God that he hears. And once he comprehends the intimacy of the sound, then he has the visuals that God is here in the burning bush. It is in the gospel that these disciples roll around with Jesus. You would think they would talk about, you know, he wore blue on today, he wore red yesterday. They don't talk about the visuals of Jesus. What he wore, what he looked like. No, they say, what was his sound? What did he say? Because the sound has power to set me free, because he is the word that became flesh. It's the sound that empowers. There's something called auditory neurological responses. That sound has such power that it can change the way you view things. Yeah. That there are certain words that I can say that will release cortisol in your system, that which causes stress and then lowers your immune system, that makes you sick. That you can say somebody's name and cortisol will be released and gives new meaning to the word, you make me sick. But they found out that there are other words that you say certain words and that they will release endorphins in your system. That all you have to do is say that word and all of a sudden your immune system is lifted up. And I believe it was one Duke University study that did studies on certain words, and they were so confused because one word kept releasing more endorphins than another word. And that word was Jesus. That every time they said Jesus, all of a sudden, even folk who didn't believe in Jesus, all of a sudden felt better from hearing the word Jesus, because speech has power. Moses hears God. Jesus is the embodiment of God. And literature and film are visual mediums that are canons of social construction. I'm able to devalue when I canonize and concretize and visualize. Sound refuses easy description. Sound demands experience. Though it can be recorded, it cannot be captured. Music is recorded, but sound refuses to be owned. Who owns the sound of the sparrow? Who owns the sound of the wind? Who owns it? Only but God. No one can put a patent that will go all the way to the Supreme Court to say, I own that sound. We've patented DNA, we've patented everything, but they've yet in the corporate world to figure out, how do I patent sound? I haven't figured it out yet, because sound speaks so powerfully of the divine. It's forever lodged in memories and in minds. And Blue Note preaching is an oral form rooted in sound, but is also a level of musicality to its construction. There is a theology embedded in the chords of the Blue Note, and there is a theology that is embedded in Blue Note preaching. The theology is transferred to the preacher, Dr. Youngblood. This is not just a cultural oral performance, but I contend it is embedded theology, whose impact gives the form of preaching in a completely different way. Jeremy Bigby, theologian and composer, in his brilliant Theology, Music, and Time, speaks to the unique power of music to convey what words cannot. Music cannot provide proposition or assertion, but music communicates moods, colors, and ideas in ways that words cannot. Neuroscientist Oliver Sacks states music is the only human invention that engages all hemispheres of the brain. Speech, mobility, memory, etc. activate a specific area of the brain. This is not the case with music. Music requires all regions to be engaged, to be heard, to be interpreted and understood. And there was a new piece known as music theory that Oliver Sacks talks about. And this music theory is dealing with Alzheimer's patients, those who have forgotten. They've lost their memory. But they found out that if you play certain songs, all of a sudden all hemispheres of the brain are now working. And they can recall things from 40, 50 years ago just like that. Because the sound moves into them. And the sound begins to transform them. Blue Note preaching recognizes this neurological fact. The call and response narrative found in the church is a part of the rich cultural musical heritage of communication. There is a social and cultural embeddedness to the musical practice. It's not just people talking back to each other. There's a theology that's going on. That in the talking and back, there is a new message that's being created. A canvas is being put up by the preacher, allowing the people to join into that moment. The call and response from the church is connected to the African griot tradition of West Africa. And this way of preaching and communication was born against the backdrop of singing cicadas and the humid air of the antebellum South. The preacher leads a dialogue. The congregation joins in to reshape this particular dialogue. And it is the job of the preacher and the job of the congregation to join together and create a new musicality in the process. I'm reminded of a story that I heard from my father of a young man who was going to a homecoming in the western portion of Georgia. And for those of you who may not be familiar with a homecoming in the South, that's a major deal. And he was invited to preach. He'd only had 1 year of seminary, but he was invited to preach. And he was going to give the best homiletical presentation that they'd ever heard in their life because he had 1 year of seminary. He was going to tell them all that he knew, what these country folk didn't know, even though he grew up in this church. He was going to tell them everything that he knew. He was going to throw in his process theology, his liberation theology. He was going to throw in a little bit of Niebuhr over here. He had some womanist ethic that he was going to throw. He's going to throw in everything that he knew in one sermon. And so he had been working on this homiletical masterpiece for all of 6 weeks, knowing that he was going to present to this rural country group of people, giving them the greatest homiletical presentation that they had ever heard. It was back in the day, and they did not have AC in the church, and so he came that day, and he was prepared to preach, and he laid out all of his papers onto the lectern, gave his preliminary remarks. And all of the windows were open as he's about to give the greatest homiletical presentation that he ever gave in his life. All the windows were open. It was August. It was hot. All the windows were open. And as he was about to speak, all of a sudden, God had a sense of humor and a breeze came through. And his message went all over the church. And the only thing he could think to say was, "Ain't he all right? Ain't he all right? Ain't he? All right." He said it for 20 minutes. Then you could hear the call and response of one mother in the church saying, "Help him, Lord." Deacons put their heads down, but there was one woman, an elder, who was in the third row, and there she was just shouting, saying, "I know he's all right. He's all right. He's good. Say it, son. Say it." And everybody was looking at him saying, "I hope he finishes soon." And he finished, and he stood in line, and he had to hear the messages and statements by people he grew up with. Said, "Son, you can come by and get some sweet potato pie later on if you want to. Sorry what happened today, but we praying with you. We're praying with you." One deacon just came through, smiled, and just patted him on the back and just kept going. Finally, he wanted to speak to that elder who had been shouting so much, who had been saying all of this stuff because he was so confused. And so after everybody was gone, he went over to this elder and he said, "Mother?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I saw that you were shouting." He said, "Oh, yes, I was shouting." She said, "You did know that my message went everywhere and all I said was, 'Ain't he all right?'" She said, "Boy, that's all you said for 20 minutes was, 'Ain't he all right?' You did notice that I really didn't have anything to say." She said, "Oh, yeah, you didn't have nothing to say." "Well, could you please explain to me why you shouted like it was the greatest message you ever heard?" And she smiled to him and said, "Just because you didn't do your job doesn't mean I'm not going to do mine." But there is a call and response that goes on in the midst of the experience. That there is a dialogue that happens between each other in the process. And Christopher Small states that Western composed music is like a journey made by a composer who goes out and comes back with what he found. Improvisation, dialogical music is a journey we take together and discover something new. The preaching journey with a Blue Note narrative is a collective experience of the body. Blue Note preaching uses a musical format to reconstruct the work of communication. Now, blues lyrics use the A-A-B format. And blues music uses what is called the pentatonic scale. And as I did research, I didn't find anybody else who was talking about it at all, Dad, that I was looking at the pentatonic scale. And that goes all the way back to Mali. That is an African scale, but also used in European folk music. that pentatonic scale that we know as the blues. And what I found out as I did some more study, that when the preacher comes to a close, that all of a sudden the cadence and the musicality switches to a pentatonic scale. So what the preacher is doing is saying one thing in terms of words, but saying another thing in terms of sound. So there is a double entendre that is happening in the midst of a close of a message. That the words may say, Jesus picked me up and turned me around. But the musicality of the sound is saying that the transatlantic slave trade could not destroy my connection to my past. That I am shouting not because of the sound, I'm shouting because I survived and I'm still surviving. So don't mistake the shout as something that is just a motive. The shout also has a theology behind it. That one could stand up and I could say Jesus is the ontological beginning that gives us existential understanding and moves us to eschatological hope. But it's easier just to say, thank you, Jesus. It's the same thing, that there's a double entendre that is happening in the midst of the communication. And that is what goes on in the close of a message. That literally you are reaching back to the blues and recognizing that God is still moving in the midst. It is a theoacoustic memory that is happening. And we need to reclaim this and lift this up and study this, that there is a speaking that goes all the way back to Mali. That when the preacher begins to close as whether C.L. Franklin or Johnny Youngblood, whoever it may be, that you are actually closing with a rhythm that goes back almost 1,000 years. And that there is in the spiritual DNA of the call and response moment that I recognize that there are two theologies going on simultaneously. There's the beauty of this. There's also in theology of sound this deep wrestling with this wellspring that Evans Crawford has dealt with, Thomas Troger has dealt with, but Zora Neale Hurston and Lawrence Levine have also lifted up over and over again. Two modes of communication are going on when the preacher preaches: a theology of words and a theology of sound. Now, I want to be able to break this thing down for y'all, so you understand. So I had to bring some help with me. My man, Wayne Baird, a gifted guitarist, is going to help you see and demonstrate this idea. And the first thing that he is going to do, he's going to play a hymn that everybody knows. But this is, I think, the most American of all hymns. It's called Amazing Grace. And the reason that it is so American, one, that it's using a pentatonic scale in many ways in its construction. But the other thing is it does not fit within the tradition of all other European hymns because the words are European, but the melody is African. It's a Creole hymn. It's a gumbo hymn. It moves together and really speaks to the American. You can play Amazing Grace with just the black keys. So in other words, if you remove the black keys, you can play, you have grace, but it will not be amazing. So you got to merge those two things together. And those two things come together, and all of a sudden it becomes incredibly American. Something unique to us on these shores. And the first way that Wayne is going to play this, he's going to play this in a straight, typical way. Now, you heard that the first way. Now, the second way, he's going to play it, he's going to bend and flat some notes. Now, the bending and the flatting, again, that again comes out of that African experience, that flatted fifth and that bending of notes. But the bending and the flatting, that is the call and response. That's the people responding to the sounds. And when he plays this time, you can now begin to imagine in your own sanctified imagination people responding to Amazing Grace. So now we have the pentatonic, we have the Amazing Grace, an Amazing Grace with bends and flats. And if we were to play it on the piano, you would notice that the right hand does one thing and the left hand does another thing in terms of call and response. That there is a theology of the sound. And it is August Wilson that really helps me understand this idea so beautifully. One of my favorite plays by him is a play entitled The Piano Lesson. The Piano Lesson is an absolutely beautiful tale. It has the story of a gentleman by the name of Bo Willie and another character by the name of Bernice, their brother and sister, and they have a piano that has been given to them by their parents. But this piano is unique. It comes from Mississippi. They live in Pittsburgh. And this piano has the carvings on one side, the carvings of Africa, and the other side, the carvings of Europe. And this piano was once owned by Mr. Sutter, who used to own the family. And it's Bo Willie who wants to sell the piano because he no longer wants to be a prisoner of his past. And it is a sister says, you cannot sell your past. You must hold on and come to grips with your past. But the unique aspect of the story is that there's a ghost in the story. A ghost you never see is Mr. Sutter, who is terrorizing Bo Willie. And in the close of the play, there is Bo Willie fighting with the ghost that you do not see. The ghost is getting the best of Bo Willie. And the only thing that Bernice can think to do is to sit down at the piano. She begins to play the blues as she plays, slowly playing. And all of a sudden, the fight begins to shift because the sound of the blues is now in the space. But still, Sutter's ghost is still getting the best of Bo Willie. And then all of a sudden, she begins to move from that blues, going into almost a Holy Ghost gospel shout. And it begins to speed up. And as she speeds up in the playing, all of a sudden, Bo Willie is able to fight and deal with Sutter because there is power in the sound. There's power in that sound. And then Bo Willie is able to throw Sutter's ghost out of the house. And now all of a sudden he is free from the haunts of his past, but yet he still holds on to his past, not to sell it. And that is the power of Blue Note preaching. Blue Note preaching is able to play a sound that does not cast the past away. Blue Note preaching allows the person to recognize their pain but not fall into despair. Blue Note preaching uses a sound that has a double entendre. Blue Note preaching is so powerful that it can change the consciousness of an individual. And we give God thanks that there is a Blue Note and that there are people who are still preaching the Blue Note. God bless you.